Okay, so this slide has a lot of important facts on it, so I'm going to kind of move my way through it a little bit slowly here. All right, and I'm going to really point out several things in here that I want you to understand. One is, all right, we're dealing with a blood pressure gradient. Okay, when we're talking about a pressure gradient, we're talking about, all right, a system that has an area of high pressure and low pressure. And we know that blood, which is what we're going to be dealing with here, is going to flow from an area of high pressure to low pressure. So the highest area of pressure for our systemic circulation is immediately that blood that gets pumped out through the aorta. All right, so going back to this slide here, this graph, this is showing us, all right, our blood pressure. High here in the aorta, and then as we start to get to the smaller vessels, like the arteries and then the arterioles and the capillaries, it decreases. Can we all agree on that pattern there? The smaller the vessels, we start to decrease in our blood pressure. And then we get into the capillaries, it decreases more. But by the time we get back to the vena cava, all right, our blood pressure is virtually zero, okay, which is good. Because again, we're following that pressure gradient. Blood is going to move from an area of high pressure to low pressure. So we can even say in the capillaries, all right, blood pressure across the capillary bed goes from 40 millimeters of mercury down to 20. But that's still higher pressure than the vena cava. So will not blood flow from the capillaries towards the vena cava? All right, just dealing with pressure gradients. We're not even dealing with any of the other stuff that I mentioned last class. All right, the answer is yes. It's always going to move from an area of high pressure to low pressure. So keep in mind, when we're talking about pressure here, okay, and our pressure gradient is highest in the aorta, it's lowest in the vena cava. All right, and it's on that loop, all right? Okay, let me pull that back up. All right, so staying on that, this is when we talked about that mean arterial pressure or the MAP pressure, right? We have that 93 millimeters of mercury straight out of the arteries near the heart, the aorta, okay, the subclavian, the brachiocephalic, the common carotids, okay? They're going to have a high pressure, all right, reading there, okay? But then the pressure is going to be virtually zero when we get to the vena cava. So that's going to force blood to flow from the arteries, all right, down into the capillary beds. I'll draw it like this, a bunch of little branches, all right, and then back into the veins, back to the vena cava. Okay, so it's going to go from the left side of the heart to the right side of the heart. And that's just, there's other factors, but this is one of the driving factors, all right, is this pressure gradient in our systemic circulation. What is the systemic circulation? The blood that gets pumped out of the left ventricle and gets returned back to the right atrium. All right, that whole system there. The pulmonary circulation is the blood that gets pumped out of the right ventricle, goes to the lungs, and then comes back into the left atrium. That's, remember, you have two circulation systems. Systemic, which is our whole body pretty much, all right, and then you have the pulmonary, which is the other part of the heart there, okay? So this is the driving force, this pressure gradient, this difference, this 93 millimeters of mercury, all right, in the arteries, and this 0 millimeters of mercury in the vena cava, all right, that driving force that's going to move blood through your systemic circulation, okay? So if we increase the gradient, we will therefore increase what we call total blood flow. So instead, if I take this number, 93 millimeters of mercury, and I turn it to 120 millimeters of mercury, all right, and this vena cava is still going to say 0. Isn't there a bigger difference now? We went from 93 to 120 difference. So we've increased the gradient. So if we increase the gradient, we're going to increase the flow. Because let's think of it like this. How did I increase the pressure here? I know I made up the number, but what can increase blood pressure? I haven't hit you with this equation, and I probably should. You won't be responsible for it. It's another equation, that a way to calculate blood pressure. Blood pressure is equal to heart rate, all right, times what we call T Oops, sorry. I'll squeeze the P in here. TPR stands for total peripheral resistance. Okay, and we're going to talk about resistance here in a moment. Okay, so bear with me. All right, this is a helpful equation. You don't need to know it for this course. It's always helped me because now, if I look at this right here, blood pressure, all right, is equal to heart rate times total peripheral resistance. Forget this. Look at this. If I increase my heart rate, would I not increase my blood pressure? Okay. So if I'm going to increase my heart rate, I'm going to push more blood out of the heart. That can increase the value here of the pressure in the aorta. So we'll go from 93 up to 120 mean arterial pressure. All right. Point being is, if we are going to eject more blood out of the heart, right, we will increase blood pressure in the aorta. So that will increase this value here. I got a lot of messy on there, okay? So this is what this talks about. The gradient is increased. This is an important concept. You should star this, write it down, sleep with it under your pillow, all right? The gradient, if we increase the gradient, all right, we will have increased the cardiac output. So the more blood, remember cardiac output is stroke volume times heart rate. So if we increase either stroke volume or heart rate or both, we increase our cardiac output. And an increased cardiac output increases that pressure gradient. So it goes from 93 millimeters of mercury to 120 millimeters of mercury. Okay, and we still have this zero value here. So that gradient increased. Okay? Again, if you're not quite, we'll work through some things, but just for right now, just memorize that. All right? If I increase the cardiac output is stroke volume, the amount of blood that's ejected per heartbeat out of the ventricles, all right, or the heart rate, or both, I'm going to increase the gradient. All right? Okay. Which, if we increase the gradient, we're going to increase total blood flow. The amount of blood that's flowing through your systemic circulation. And if you think about it, the more blood that the heart pushes out, it's got to go through systemic circulation and it gets dumped back in to the heart. All right? So that's what's going to happen here. Okay? All right, so again, we'll understand this more as we work through today's lesson. Okay? But I have to talk to you about resistance. Resistance is futile. All right? So when we talk about resistance, if you like to take it from the physics standpoint, we'll talk about friction. Okay? So resistance is going to be the friction that blood encounters as it's circulating throughout your circulatory system. And there's three factors for that. The first one is viscosity. Okay? And that means how thick the blood is. Okay? The second is vessel length. The longer the vessel, the more resistance. And then finally, the lumen size. Okay? Do you think that blood will encounter more resistance in this lumen or more resistance in this lumen? Smaller. Yeah, that's right. Okay? It's easier to drink water through a big thick straw or a big wide straw than it is a tiny straw. You ever seen those cocktail straws that they serve at bars? You try to suck through whatever you're drinking through one of those. It takes a lot of work. But when you get a bigger straw, easier to pull through, less resistance. Okay? So that's what we're talking about. So viscosity, okay, vessel length, and lumen size. Okay? So what is our resistance? This is what is the friction occurs when the blood contacts the vessel wall. Okay? So we're going to talk about laminar flow and all that soon here, all right? So what it does is it opposes blood flow. So it's going to decrease blood flow. You increase resistance, you decrease the flow. We'll talk about that here in a moment, okay? So this term here, peripheral resistance, talks about, all right, the amount of resistance that the blood encounters on the blood vessel wall periphery. All right, so I'll draw this horrible picture for you. You're welcome. All right, so when blood is flowing down, here's our blood vessel. And when blood flows down in the center, it's going to flow like that. That's called laminar flow, straight on. Okay? But the blood that's close to the vessel wall is going to start to swirl, goes in a circle, because it bangs into the vessel wall. All right? And it makes these little currents here. Okay? We don't like that. That's not good. Anytime you get turbulent blood flow, all right, there's a possibility of, one, damage to the blood vessel wall if your blood pressure is too high, or clotting. All right, we don't want that. Okay, so we want, all right, our blood to experience as a minimal amount of resistance as possible. But we can't help it when the blood flows against the blood vessel wall. It just starts to bang into it. Okay, so that's that peripheral resistance. It's the amount of resistance that the blood is going to encounter in the blood vessels. All right, well, more along the periphery of the blood vessels. All right, but this is a different, I'm jumping ahead here. I apologize. All right, so let's talk about viscosity here. Actually, let me jump back because I don't think I explained this very well. All right, the peripheral resistance. All right, this is where I come with that equation again. All right, that heart rate times TPR, total peripheral resistance. P, not R. There we go. All right. So the peripheral resistance is the resistance, let me rephrase that, of the blood vessels themselves outside of the heart. Okay. There shouldn't be any resistance in the heart. I mean, there is a slight amount, but we're not going to get into that. Okay. So that's where the TPR portion comes from when we talk about peripheral resistance. There is also peripheral resistance on the blood flow, which we're going to get to in a second here. All right. Blood viscosity, how thick it is. Okay? Motor oil is thick. That's why we like to use it to lubricate your engine. Right? We don't want to use water to lubricate the engine. It's not as good. Right? But the thickness counts. Well, what makes blood thick? The blood-formed elements that are involved. All right? Think about the white blood cells, the red blood cells, the platelets, the proteins, all right? All the stuff. Because what's the majority of our blood? Well, plasma, but what is the majority of plasma? Water. That's right. It's liquidy. Okay? That's what gives blood its nice liquidy portion. So if you're dehydrated, you're going to have less water in your plasma. Your blood will be a little bit thicker. All right. But if you had, all right, say like blood doping is a perfect example, or if you went to go climb a mountain, all right, and you're going to go be at 20,000 feet for a couple of weeks. Remember EPO, erythropoietin, that hormone that increases red blood cell production? It's going to start pumping out red blood cells like mad. So over the course of a couple of weeks, your blood is going to be thick. And I'm not going to say it's as thick as syrup, but it becomes thicker than what it normally is because there's more red blood cells there. Because you need more red blood cells, because you need more hemoglobin, so you can bind more oxygen. Okay, that's what's going to happen. So when we talk about viscosity, when we increase it, blood doping, that's what I was telling you about before. These guys were going in and taking like 2 liters of blood out and storing it, and then right before a competition, they go and inject all that blood back into their body. Okay, that's going to make the blood thicker. Dehydration, right? Decreasing the water. All right. Anemia is a great way to decrease viscosity. Because why? It's a decrease in red blood cells. And red blood cells are the formed elements of your blood. So you won't have as much stuff in your blood. So it'll be more liquidy. Okay? I hate to use that word liquidy, but you know what I mean. Okay? So keep in mind, if you increase the viscosity, you increase the resistance. Thicker blood. All right? I would much rather have motor oil pumping through my veins than syrup. All right, something that's similar to that, okay, in viscosity. All right, trust me, your systemic circulation would like that too. Okay, so basically when we're talking about viscosity, it's all the stuff, the particles. Cool with that? That's not too bad, right? And it makes sense. Your heart does not want to pump through syrup or glue, right? It wants to pump something closer to water. Okay, so that's the first, all right, item that will cause increased resistance is if we increase the blood viscosity. All right, vessel length, okay? Longer vessels will make more resistance. So as the longer the vessel, okay, compared to this short vessel, it's going to, because remember, when blood is flowing down the length of this vessel here, all right, along the periphery here, this is where that turbulent blood flow I was telling you about. It's going to experience resistance. So it's got to experience that resistance the whole length of that vessel. But if it's nice and short, it's going to experience less friction because it's shorter. So we talked about this, I believe it was Monday. Wait, today's Wednesday, right? Okay, yeah, on Monday. Okay, remember we talked about angiogenesis and regression? Okay, that's when you start working out like mad and you start to build up a bunch of skeletal muscle tissue, all right? And then we got to increase our blood supply to that tissue, so we grow new blood vessels. Takes a while, okay? Same thing if you gain a lot of weight in adipose tissue, same thing will happen. And then when you decide to become sedentary and not work out anymore, you lose all that skeletal muscle tissue, or you lose all this weight and your adipose tissue decreases, then you undergo regression. So if we decrease the amount of real estate for our vasculature, all right, then we will decrease the resistance. If we increase the amount of real estate for our vasculature, have more blood vessels involved, then we're going to increase the resistance. Folks cool with that? I've seen a test question asked on this, by the way. Weight gain versus weight loss. Angiogenesis and regression. Okay? All right, so that's the second factor that plays a role in resistance. All right, the last one is, I think, the easiest one, radius. Okay, bigger pipes you can get more water to flow through. Smaller pipes, right, trying to get that same volume of water to go through it is much more difficult. Hence, when you're taking a shower, all right, you have those little holes where the water can come out. Okay, and it gives it a little bit more force. So the smaller the radius, what's the radius? Here's a circle. What's the radius of the circle? Is it this or is it this? The second one, right? The radius is from the center of the circle out to the circumference, the outer, whatever the wall is. The diameter is the total distance across the lumen or the opening here. Okay? All right, so the smaller the radius, all right, the more the resistance will be, okay? So if we're going to draw the radius, we just have arrows and all of this. And we're talking about the center. That's where the radius goes, from the center of the lumen out to the vessel wall there, okay? So the smaller the radius, the greater the resistance. And that's where this comes into play, laminar flow. Okay, that was that example that I showed you. I just got a little excited and went ahead of myself. So we have this blood vessel, very small blood vessel. Then we have this really big blood vessel. Okay, so we'll have more laminar flow in our bigger blood vessel. All right, and we'll have less laminar flow in our smaller blood vessel, and the blood along the periphery will bump into the vessel walls, and it creates a turbulent blood flow along the periphery of the vessel. Okay? So the blood that's in the laminar flow or in the center of the blood vessel is going to flow faster. Okay? Because it's not encountering any resistance. It's just flowing down the middle. But the blood that's on the periphery here is going to bang into the vessel wall and get slowed down. If you've ever taken a physics class, that's what happens. You get what's called the friction coefficient, decreases the amount of force. Speed is a way to measure force, so it's going to slow things down. Okay? So the vessel wall is going to create resistance. Okay? So another way to say this is the diameter increases, resistance decreases. And as a result, flow increases. So we're going to use this equation here. Okay? This symbol means proportional to. Okay, so flow, F, is proportional to the radius. If we increase the radius, all right, then we increase, all right, the amount of flow going on. Okay? So basically, let's put this in physiological terms. If we dilate our blood vessel, if we go from here to here, we've increased our diameter, right? Compared to this. Okay? So we've caused vasodilation, and we've increased the diameter, and our lumen has become bigger here. So we allow more blood to flow through this larger blood vessel than this smaller blood vessel. Because in the smaller blood vessel, the blood encounters more resistance. It slows down. Okay? In the larger blood vessel, it encounters less resistance. So we increase the flow. Okay? I don't expect you to know that flow is proportional to the radius to the fourth power. Okay? I want you to know that, let's keep it simple, as we increase the diameter, we increase the flow because we decrease the resistance. That's it. All right, there's another equation here on the next page, but now we're going to start to get, things will get a little bit more interesting. Okay? Do you feel comfortable with that somewhat? Okay? If you're not, it's okay. Watch this video. Remember, it's going to run into the wall regardless because it's in a tube. You know what I mean? Just like when you're taking a straw, you're sucking up liquid, it's going to run. But when you're sucking fluid up through that tube and through that straw, the liquid in the center of it is going to be moving faster than the liquid that's running into the wall of the straw. Because as it does, it bounces off. It just bounces off and it starts to go through. If you've ever watched, I'm weird like this, okay? But I've sat by a river or two in my life, okay? And I've watched the flow of the river. And you can see where if at the center of the river, stuff will move really fast, okay? But the stuff near the bank of the river doesn't. And it's because the water just bangs into the ridge. And it starts to make what they call, if you've ever heard the term eddy currents, they're these small miniature currents. And they just swirl around, okay? You won't see them so much in the center unless there's something there to cause it. But what it will do is the water bangs into the bank of the river, it just starts to swirl in this direction. And anytime that happens, it slows down the flow, right? And so that's what will happen here, okay? So just keep that in mind. Memorize it for right now. Vasodilation, we're increasing the diameter, all right? That will increase the flow because there's less resistance. If we cause vasoconstriction, all right, and we make the diameter smaller, we're going to decrease the flow because we've increased the resistance. Okay? And resistance opposes what? I'll show you right here. Resistance opposes blood flow. That's an important concept. Okay? So if you increase resistance, you will decrease flow. I'm going to show you. I'm going to show you in this equation here. If you're into the math stuff, I'm not a huge math fan, but it's a way to describe things using numbers and letters and fun stuff. Okay, so let's get into this guy right here. TBF, total blood flow. All right, this is an important concept here because when we're talking about our total blood flow, now we're going to look here at the relationship between blood pressure, okay, what we just talked about, blood pressure, all right, and blood flow, okay, in regards to, well, including resistance. So what effects do resistance and blood pressure have on blood flow? That's what we're going to answer now. And we're going to use this equation to describe it. Okay? Flow is proportion to our delta P over R. Now, what the heck does that mean? Okay? I will show you here. I'll come right back to that slide. What is all that? Right here. Total blood flow, all right, is proportional to the pressure gradient, all right? Remember that pressure gradient? All right, 93 millimeters of mercury right out of the gate, right out. It's like a horse on a race. It starts off really fast, then slows down, okay? Unless you're, I don't know, what was the name of that real popular horse? They made a movie about it. Seabiscuit, yeah, he got faster, all right? But right out of the gate, they're sprinting, so all that blood that's coming right out of the heart, right, has high pressure, right? And that's going to be our map, our mean arterial pressure, which we're going to use that value of 93. Okay, it's 93 millimeters of mercury. It's racing around the body. It's racing around the body. It's starting to slow down, starting to slow down. It gets to the vena cava. It's zero. It's lost all its energy. Okay, it's just flowing into the heart. Okay, so we're going to see that's the pressure gradient. That's what delta P means. Okay, delta is a change. That's all that symbol signifies. It's a change. And that change is going to be the 93 millimeters of mercury, all right, in the aorta minus the pressure in the vena cava, which is zero. So it's 93. It's the change. Okay? And look at this. It says established by the heart. What does that mean? Going back to this, cardiac output. Okay? Heart rate times stroke volume. Okay? That's going to influence our pressure gradient. That's that equation. I'm telling you, it's an important equation. Okay? So then the pressure gradient is divided by the resistance. And that is basically what those three things I just told you about. Viscosity, the lumen diameter, and the length of the blood vessel. Okay? All of that is going to influence resistance. Okay? As the blood moves through the vessels. So let's go back here. We're going to hit this. I'm going to come right back to that slide. Okay? All right. So when we're talking about total blood flow, we're going to be talking about the blood moving through the system over a period of time, all right, usually in minutes. So we're going to use minute as our time here, all right? So this is huge. Flow is proportional to the pressure gradient divided by resistance. That's this equation here. Okay? Flow is proportional to the pressure gradient, okay? And that whole pressure gradient is determined, all right, through systemic circulation. Blood flowing as it's ejected out of the heart, into the aorta, down into the arteries, down into the arterioles, through the capillary bed, into the venules, into the veins, into the vena cava. Okay? That is our pressure gradient, and that's going to be divided by resistance. Okay, so when we talk about the systemic pressure gradient, okay, this is what we saw on that first slide here that we talked about tonight. As the gradient increases, and I'll use that other example, 120, all right, the heart starts to pump out 120 millimeters of mercury. What's mercury? Hg. I was going to say Mg. That's magnesium. All right. 120 millimeters of mercury is now, remember I said we've increased the cardiac output, and now the aorta is showing us that it's 120 millimeters of mercury instead of 93, but it's still zero in the vena cava. All right, so we increased our pressure gradient because what did we do? How did I increase my pressure gradient? It's right there on the board, on the slide. I increased the cardiac output. And the cardiac output is going to be the heart rate and the stroke volume. So if I'm pushing more blood out of the heart per beat, that's going to increase my cardiac output. That's going to increase the pressure gradient. Or I speed the heart up a little bit. Increase the heart rate. Okay? Okay, so the pressure gradient is really going to be dependent on the heart. What's the heart doing? What's the heart doing? Is it beating faster? Is the force of the contractions more powerful and it's squeezing more blood out? Remember the ionotropic agents, all right, when we get more calcium being released from the sarcoplasmic reticulum, okay? And we form more cross bridges so the heart can contract. Remember Frank's Starling law? All right, that Frank-Starling law is causing the heart to contract more forcibly, all right, so it can squirt out more blood, increasing our stroke volume. If we increase the stroke volume, all right, we are going to increase our cardiac output. You guys are going to hate me because I'm going to keep writing this equation out. You learn a lot from this equation. I don't think it's the answer to life. Does anyone know what the answer to life is? 42. 42. No one knew that? You guys didn't know that? That's the answer to life. 42.
Is that when you know it?
No, you just got to read The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy or watch the movie. No. And
Is that when you figure out what?
no, these two guys, the characters in the book. There's a movie. One of my favorite actors, Mos Def, is in it, and him and this other guy are traveling through the universe trying to find out what the meaning of life is. And they, at the end of it, spoiler alert, they find out it's 42. It's kind of anticlimactic, but anyways, I think it's funny. Yeah, that's funny. It's a good book. He answered 42 because you said it. See? Smart man. I like it. Okay, so keep that in mind. I'm going to get rid of all this stuff that's confusing me. Okay? So you want to increase the gradient, increase the cardiac output. That's simple. Let's keep it simple. Okay? So if we increase the gradient, then we're going to increase flow, right? If now, let's make up some numbers here. The pressure gradient before was 93, and then we'll just say that the resistance is 10. Okay? You divide that, it's going to be 9.3. Can we all agree about that? 9.3 millimeters of mercury per whatever. Okay? So now if we change that, now we're going to make the pressure gradient 120. And we're going to keep the resistance the same. So we just increased the pressure gradient. Well, 120 divided by 10 is what? Don't scare me, y'all. 12. It's 12. All right, it's 12. So is 12 not larger than 9.3? Right? Okay, yeah. Okay, so mathematically you can see if we increase the pressure gradient, we're going to increase flow. Okay, so now going to resistance here, if we increase resistance, we're going to decrease flow. So there's an inverse relationship. You all remember that, right? What inverse means? If one comes up, the other has to come down, right? There's an inverse relationship. So if we increase, all right, the resistance, we're going to decrease flow. Okay, perfect example. Let's make the lumen smaller. That's going to increase the resistance, right? It's going to slow blood down. It's going to encounter more resistance there. Okay? So if we increase the resistance, we can make the blood thicker. We'll dehydrate you. All right? Or we'll blood dope you. All right? We'll just pump you full of EPO, erythropoietin, and you'll start making more red blood cells. All right? We can make your blood vessels longer. Well, how do we do that? What's that process called? Angiogenesis. We'll grow more blood vessels. We'll add more blood vessels to your systemic circulation, and that makes it bigger. Okay? Or we can just make it easy and just decrease the lumen diameter. Make the blood vessels smaller. Okay? So those are a couple things. This example in your book is basically explains what I just talked about with you folks. Okay? So you can see here, how do we want to increase blood flow? Okay, here we go. We can have the heart pump out more blood. Cardiac output. We can increase the stroke volume or the heart rate. That makes our pressure gradient steeper. See how we go from this value, let's say that's the 93. Show you on the chart. 93 millimeters of mercury. And we've gone now to 120 millimeters of mercury. So we've made it steeper now. All right? So we have a larger pressure gradient. Or we can do this. For resistance, we can vasodilate the blood vessel. Less resistance. Blood can flow through easier. Okay? We can make the blood thinner. Okay? Make you anemic. That's always fun. Okay? Or we can have regression. We can have fewer blood vessels involved. Lose a lot of weight. All right. Okay. So now, how do we decrease the total blood flow? Okay, no problem. We go from that 93 millimeters of mercury. Now we'll go down to 50. Okay, slow the heart down. Let's slow the heart down. Let's make your stroke volume less. How do we do that? A couple different ways. We can make the heart not contract as hard, won't squirt out as much blood. All right, that's one of the ways. Okay, a couple other ways. Remember the effects of increase the afterload. Remember, there's three things there's the preload, then there's the contractility of the heart, and then there's the afterload. So the preload is how much blood do we put into the ventricle before you even contract? Let's decrease your end diastolic volume. Instead of having about 140 millimeters in there, let's put 60 millimeters in there. All right, we decrease the preload. We'll decrease the stroke volume that way. Okay, increase the afterload. There's now more resistance. The heart has to push harder to get the blood out of the ventricles because your systemic circulation, your blood pressure is too high. All right, there's more resistance out there. That's the afterload. Okay, if you don't remember that, go back to that one slide in your book. I'll show it to you in a second. All right, or we can cause vasoconstriction, all right, and we can cause the diameter to decrease, which causes more resistance. So if you're trying to remember what the heck Dr. Kaz is talking about in regards to that slide, oh, I don't even have it. It's not even in that slideshow. All right, so forget it. it's back in chapter 19 on the heart. Dang it. I should put it in here. Okay. Okay, so let's jump into, all right, how do we regulate blood pressure? How do we regulate blood flow? Okay, so we're going to talk about that. And here's the beautiful part. You already know a lot about what I'm going to talk about here because we talked about it when we talked about the heart. Okay, in chapter 19. Okay, so keep in mind, this now goes back to chapter 1. Our blood pressure needs to be kept in a certain range. Remember the set point? Remember, I hope, I just taught this to my flex class yesterday. What's our body temperature? What should the value be? Oh yeah, or 37 degrees Celsius, okay? Okay, 98.6 fluctuates in this range of 96.4 to 99.1. The set point is 98.6. Your body likes to keep it there, but sometimes it goes a little bit higher, and sometimes it goes a little bit lower. This is our set point. Okay, this is the normal range. So if you're in this range, if your body temperature is in this range, you're considered to be normal. Okay. So our blood pressure, what's our blood pressure value? What's the average, the normal value? 120 over 80. That's right. Okay. So 120 over 80 is the normal range. Okay. Now these values are subject to change depending on who you talk to. Okay. And we talked about it on Monday, you know, that there was talk, and the American Cardiac Association said that they were going to change the blood pressure. I'm not going to get into that all again because part of that, some people think it's a political thing because they're just going to try to subscribe more hypertension medicine, you know, because they want to drop it. But 90 over 60 is considered the low end of the range. And then 140, okay, 140 over 90 is the high end. Okay, so again, this is the set point. All right, and then from here to here, that's the range. So that's what our body is trying to do. It's trying to stay within this proper range. Guess what? That's homeostasis, right? Okay, and it's based on that negative feedback mechanism. If something gets too high, we make it go lower. Remember, the stimuli, okay, the actual reaction to the stimuli is always going to be in the opposite direction. If your body temperature increases, all right, your body's going to try to decrease your body temperature, okay? So that's what we're going to deal here with when we get into our regulation of blood pressure and blood flow. Our main goal is to always cause tissue perfusion. We want to be able to bathe all the tissues in, I don't want to say in blood, but we always want to be able to get enough blood to them so we can provide nutrients. And remember, we're going to drop off the groceries and pick up the garbage. Drop off the nutrients to the tissues, pick up the trash, and get rid of it. That's what we want. That's that tissue perfusion, okay? So we want blood pressure to be high enough so all the tissues can be perfused, but we saw this in the capillary bed. We don't want it to be so high as it damages the blood vessels, okay? Because when you start to damage blood vessels, what happens? What's that condition that we call clogging of the arteries? Arterial sclerosis, atherosclerosis, okay? And it all starts with the blood vessel getting damaged first. They don't talk to you about that so much. They always say it's plaque. You're getting plaque buildup. Well, how's that get there? What happened? Right? How did that start? You don't get a scab unless you've damaged your skin, right? It just doesn't appear there, right? And that's what plaque is sort of like. It's like a scab, not really, but you have to damage the blood vessel first to get that plaque buildup going on. And we don't want that, okay? So when we talk about our blood pressure, look, oh my gosh, there it is again. Cardiac output, okay? Cardiac output, all right, is going to affect your blood pressure. Also, resistance, okay? Remember, blood pressure, going to that equation that you do not have to know, but which will be helpful. Heart rate times total peripheral resistance. Okay? And we haven't talked about it so much, but blood volume. Okay? So if we're going to deal with homeostasis, that means we have to have a receptor, a control center, and an effector. Well, in this case, our control center is going to be the nervous system and the endocrine system, which is pretty much in most of the cases when we're dealing with that whole homeostatic system. Okay? So we're going to talk about now how the nervous system and the endocrine system are going to affect your blood pressure. Okay? And the nice thing about it is, think of the nervous system, that's going to be the quick fix. That'll be the immediate response. Like if you go to stand up out of your chair, okay, you're going to change blood flow. And how come all the blood doesn't just pour out of your head and down into your feet because of gravity? All right, like if you go from the laying position and if you go to stand up really quick. I'm sure some of you have done that before and you got a little dizzy. That's because your blood vessels haven't accommodated fast enough to keep the blood flow consistent to your brain. All right? Well, we're going to talk about that. The endocrine system is going to take a little bit longer, but its effects are going to be more sustained. Okay? So the nervous system is quick, short term, doesn't last too long. Okay? All right? I shouldn't say it doesn't last too long. Won't last or won't be as long or as sustained as the endocrine system. Okay, so what the heck? Autonomic reflexes? Easy. Remember the autonomic nervous system made up of two divisions, sympathetic and parasympathetic. That's what we're going to talk about here. All right, how your sympathetic and your parasympathetic nervous system is going to affect your blood pressure short term. Guess what? It's all done in the medulla oblongata. Okay? So, like that example that I gave you, if you stand up too fast, all right, we have to adjust, all right, to the movement of the blood and your blood pressure. So we're going to affect your cardiac output and your resistance, all right, when this occurs. And we're going to go through that. So now you get to learn about what happens like when you go to stand up. That's kind of cool. Probably this whole time you're thinking, oh, Dr. Koch, you keep going over these different equations. How does that pertain to me in life? Well, now we're going to talk about how this is going to affect you in your life. All right? So back in chapter 19, we talked about the cardiovascular center. Okay, remember the cardio acceleratory center and the cardio inhibitory center? All right, that's part of our cardiovascular center. This is going to be found in the medulla oblongata, okay? And you have, remember what a nuclei is? What's a nuclei? Not a cell nuclei, but a nervous system nuclei, specifically central nervous system. You guys remember? A nuclei is a cluster of cell bodies, okay? Cell bodies, okay? A tract are axons, in the central nervous system. In the peripheral nervous system, a cluster of cell bodies, we call it a ganglion. Usually synapses occur there, okay? And in the peripheral nervous system, a bundle of axons is called a sciatic nerve, all right? So a bundle in the peripheral nervous system, a bundle of axons is a nerve, okay? We just call them different things depending on if we're in the nervous system, or if we're in the peripheral nervous system or the central nervous system. Okay, so we have two, all right, areas here. We have the cardiac center and the vasomotor center. So you can look at those two terms and you can figure out what they do. Cardiac center, heart. Vasomotor, blood vessels. Okay, just look at the term. Okay, so when we talk about the cardiac center here, right, we're going to influence cardiac output, which means we're going to influence heart rate and stroke volume. Okay, that's simple. Okay, the vasomotor center is only going to deal with the blood vessels, okay, so how does it do it that way? Just through diameter, because that's all it can do. It can't make the blood more viscous. All right, blood vessels can't make the blood more viscous. We got something else to do that. All right, and it can't make an immediate growth of a blood vessel. That takes a little bit of time. So the only aspect of resistance that the autonomic nervous system can affect is blood vessel diameter. Okay, either makes it bigger or smaller. That's it. Okay. Okay. So that's when we're going to deal with vasoconstriction here. We'll get into that. Good so far? Not too bad? All right. Okay. So let's get into the cardiac center first. We talked about this back in chapter 19. You have the cardioacceleratory center and the cardioinhibitory center. So what speeds up the heart? Sympathetic nervous system. What slows down the heart? The parasympathetic nervous system. Okay? So this is a little bit of review here. All right? So the sympathetic nervous system is going to affect the SA node, aka the pacemaker, and myocardium. What's that? Cardiac muscle cells in the heart wall. Okay, that's what it's going to affect. Okay, our pacemaker and then our cardiac muscle cells in the heart wall. Okay, so we can either increase the heart rate or we can also increase the force of contraction. Okay, that's very important because when we're dealing with the cardioinhibitory center, right, we can only affect the heart rate. Cardioinhibitory center cannot affect the force of contraction. Right? So if we increase heart rate and we increase the force of contraction, we are going to, I'm not going to say AKA, but force of contraction is going to influence stroke volume. Heart rate is obvious, HR. So if we increase heart rate and or stroke volume, we are going to influence cardiac output, right? Okay, thereby influencing blood pressure. Okay, we'll talk about more along what the sympathetic nervous system, how it affects blood pressure with resistance here in a moment. Okay, so increasing the heart rate and increasing the force of contraction causes, all right, that reciprocal increase in the cardiac output, and therefore it will increase, excuse me, blood pressure. You know, I like to think, I review these slides, just sometimes I like to add stuff to them and take stuff away from them. And when I'm going over them, I move through them so much faster, but I feel like I'm crawling along tonight. I apologize. If you need me to move faster, I will. Are we doing okay with the, okay. All right, so let's get to the cardioinhibitory center. Let's decrease, all right, slow things down, okay? That affects the SA node and the AV node. Remember, the AV node is the bottleneck, okay? That's when we can really slow things down, all right, especially when we need a little bit more time between the atria contracting and the ventricles contracting. All right, so we're going to decrease the heart rate, and also we're going to decrease the conduction system, specifically at the AV node. All right, that's our bottleneck. So if we decrease the conduction rate, then we're going to slow down depolarization of the ventricular cells. So by doing that, all right, we're going to decrease cardiac output and blood pressure. Good so far? I hope. All right, so that's the cardio inhibitory center and the cardio acceleratory center. All right, so the other nuclei is going to be the vasomotor center. Now, again, if you remember it, awesome. If you don't, it's okay. But your blood vessels are only influenced by one division of your autonomic nervous system, and that's the sympathetic nervous system. The parasympathetic nervous system does not play a role. Right? You know how it plays? You have both divisions that play a role on the heart. Sympathetic speeds it up, parasympathetic slows it down. Okay? That's dual innervation. Right? We don't have that relationship when it comes to blood vessels. It's only one single division, and that's going to be the sympathetic nervous system. Don't be fooled. Parasympathetic nervous system does not play a role, all right, in the diameter of your blood vessels. Can we all agree on that? You promise me that you'll never forget that? Okay. All right. So we have this certain tone. It's called vasomotor tone. Your blood vessels are usually in a slightly constricted state. As you're sitting here now, all right, several of your blood vessels are slightly constricted. Okay, so it's going to offer a certain amount of resistance. Okay, so if I want to slow down my blood flow, all right, or I want to increase my resistance, they'll contract more and they'll vasoconstrict more. All right, if I want to get more blood flow and I want to, then I will vasodilate. So think of the sympathetic nervous system. If you have a dimmer switch, for example, does anyone here have a dimmer switch in their house? I do. I've been installing I feel like a million of them lately. But what happens is, think of it as a dimmer switch. So we're just going to turn the dimmer switch slightly on a little bit, so the lights won't be too bright. All right, and think of the brightness of the light being the amount of constriction going on in the blood vessels. So if I want to constrict those blood vessels a lot, I turn that dimmer switch all the way up. Light gets really bright. Okay, if I want to virtually make it where they're not vasoconstricting, I turn that dimmer switch all the way off. Okay. One switch, that's the sympathetic nervous system, okay? All right, anyways, so we're talking about the vasomotor center here, all right? We're going to discuss, here's that norepinephrine again. We saw that affecting the heart. That's the neurotransmitter, okay? So the sympathetic neurons, all right, that are going to synapse onto our blood vessels are going to release norepinephrine. Not only that, the sympathetic nervous system can also stimulate the adrenal medulla to release norepinephrine and epinephrine, which will do the same thing. Okay, so the adrenal medulla will release epinephrine and norepinephrine, which can then affect the blood vessels also. So you can actually have the sympathetic neuron that's synapsing onto the blood vessel, releasing its norepinephrine, and then we can get norepinephrine and epinephrine from the adrenal medulla too. That can also help, kind of like what we saw in the heart, right? When we're trying to increase the heart rate. Okay. So when we're dealing with blood vessels, we have smooth muscle. Okay. We have smooth muscle cells in the middle layer, the tunica media, right? And so we have what we call alpha-1 receptors and beta-2 receptors. Okay. So when we stimulate the alpha-1 receptors, that causes vasoconstriction. When we stimulate the beta-2 receptors, we have vasodilation. Okay? Just keep that in mind. That's how, and again, it's all from the sympathetic nervous system. No parasympathetic nervous system. When we stimulate the alpha-1, we get vasoconstriction. When we stimulate the beta-2, then we get vasodilation. Beta blockers. Beta blockers. Remember beta blockers? Talked about it in chapter 19. All right, beta blockers, all right, will help, all right, with your heart, so more so with blood pressure because it decreases your heart rate, helps it decrease blood pressure. Okay, won't have as much of an issue here, all right, on the blood vessels unless you're taking too much. Okay, so 3 things will happen with our vasomotor center. Okay, so we have our sympathetic activation, that's the neuron releasing the norepinephrine, and we have the adrenal gland, all right, that's going to be releasing epinephrine and norepinephrine, all right, onto the blood vessel here. So we'll get increased peripheral resistance. Well, I don't know what that means. Well, it's because we're getting vasoconstriction. Okay, so that's how we increase our peripheral resistance, because we're activating the alpha-1 receptors on these blood vessels, and they're causing vasoconstriction to occur, and that's going to increase that's going to increase our blood pressure. BP is equal to heart rate times total peripheral resistance. Okay? So if we increase, all right, our peripheral resistance, then we're going to increase our blood pressure. Okay? Now, I haven't talked about blood volume so much here, but if we start to increase, for example, our activity levels, you start running. We talked about this in the beginning in lab for the blood vessels here. Most of your blood, when you're sitting here right now, is going to be in your venous, in your veins, in your venous blood system. Okay? When you start to exercise, remember the skeletal muscles will pump, they'll contract and relax, and they pump blood. All right, they move the blood through your veins. So that's what's going to happen here. Okay? We now start to move, all right, the blood here, all right, from our venous reservoirs, our veins, back into our general circulation. And that will increase our blood pressure here. Okay? And then we also have redistribution of blood flow. This is another effect that the vasomotor has. All right, depends on what tissues are really requiring for their metabolic activities. Okay? But we'll see, all right, when we have more blood heading to the skeletal muscles and to the heart, all right, we'll see the blood moving. For example, when you're working out, all right, so you just, and I think I talked about this last class, you just had a big meal, okay? And all that food is sitting in your stomach and your digestive system, so the blood usually will be shunted towards your GI tract. So you can, as you're digesting the food, that those nutrients can move into your blood, all right? But when you activate the sympathetic nervous system, right, like you're all of a sudden being chased by something like a tiger or whatever, right, then that blood gets shunted away from your GI tract and goes to the heart and to the skeletal muscles so you can get the heck out of there, all right? So it shunts it away from those other tissues there. So basically, if we want to stop all of this stuff here, we just turn off the sympathetic division, okay? Then you'll get a decrease in your blood pressure because we will get a decrease in the total peripheral resistance because the blood vessels vasodilate, okay? And then we shunt the blood, all right, back into the venous reservoirs, all right, back into those veins there, and that also will decrease our blood pressure. All right. So let's talk about some of our sensory receptors that are going to play a role. Baroreceptors. This is important here because especially when we're dealing. Has anyone ever heard of a carotid massage? Oh yeah. Okay. Well, that's literally what it is. A carotid massage is if somebody's blood pressure spikes up. Are you familiar with it? No. Well, do some of you folks know how to palpate out the carotid artery? Okay, if you've taken first aid or whatever, that's one of the first things that you know, right? So basically what you do is you come and palpate out the carotid artery on the neck, and you slowly massage that area there. And what that does is that affects these baroreceptors that are in the wall of what they call the carotid sinus, all right? And that helps to decrease the blood pressure because you're decreasing the stimulation of the baroreceptors. It's called the carotid massage. It's just something if somebody's blood pressure gets really out of whack. Does it happen? I mean, does it work every time? No, right? Depends on what the cause of the increase in blood pressure, all right? But these baroreceptors, all right, are located within the walls of our blood vessels, and they respond to how much stretch is in the vessel wall. So if there's more blood flowing through the vessel, it's going to increase the pressure, it's going to increase the stretch. You're going to have an increased firing rate of these baroreceptors, okay? That's what we're saying here. Firing rates change, all right, as blood pressure changes. So if blood pressure increases, the firing rate of these baroreceptors increase. If blood pressure decreases, that's going to be less stretch on the vessel wall. That's going to be a decrease in the firing rate of the baroreceptors. So they're located in a couple areas. The arch of the aorta and then in the carotid sinus. All right, and that's where I got the carotid massage from. I swear to you, I didn't make it up. It's a legitimate thing, okay? You can Google it. All right, so when we're dealing with the aortic arch, those baroreceptors are going to transmit their information up to the autonomic nervous system through the vagus nerve, cranial nerve number 10. All right? So, and then the carotid sinus, those baroreceptors are going to transmit their information through the glossopharyngeal nerve, cranial nerve number 9. Okay? So it's these baroreceptors that play a large role in regulation of systemic blood pressure. Okay. Now with the carotid sinus, it's going to monitor, because it's located in the neck, it's going to monitor blood pressure more so in the head and neck. Okay. But the aortic arch baroreceptors, that's the blood pouring right out of the heart, first thing. Okay. So it's going to play a larger role in systemic blood pressure. All right. I showed you this slide before in chapter 19 here. All right. Basically, it's just showing you. Here's your, all right, your cardiovascular center here, and it's got the cardiac center and the vasomotor center and the medulla oblongata, right? And it's showing here, right, which nerves are transmitting down to which structures. I'm not going to go, I already went over this with you folks. If you want a quick review, you quickly go over that. Okay, so let's talk about, this is easy. And when I say this is easy, I'm not saying this class is easy, but I know I talked about this in my 210 class briefly. So some of this should start to sound a little bit familiar when we were going over chapter 16, all right, special senses, especially when we were talking about the baroreceptors here, okay? So let's talk about it for a second. All right, so the autonomic reflex, all right, will be set off when the baroreceptor, all right, is stimulated either by an increase or a decrease in blood pressure. So if the blood pressure decreases, the amount of stretch on the vessel wall will be less. So the baroreceptor will fire less, okay? So we'll have a decreased firing rate, all right? So this is what happens. Your blood pressure is decreasing for whatever reason. Say you're hemorrhaging. Okay, you're losing blood. We got to respond. Okay, so that's going to activate the cardioaccelerory center. Okay, which is the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system, and it's going to cause an increase in the cardiac output. And we talked about it. It's going to increase the heart rate, and it's going to increase the total peripheral resistance. It's going to cause the blood vessels to vasoconstrict. How does it do that? It stimulates the alpha-1 receptors. And those alpha-1 receptors cause the blood vessel to vasoconstrict. Okay? All right. So at the same time, it's going to inhibit the cardioinhibitory center. It's going to make sure that that's not activated, because we can't have the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system working at the same time. They oppose each other when it comes to, all right, the cardiac center. So we're going to shut down our parasympathetic nervous system. Not the whole system, all right, but its effects on the cardioinhibitory center, okay? So now we're going to see an activation in the vasomotor center, through the sympathetic nervous system, and that's going to cause our vasoconstriction. That's going to increase our total peripheral resistance. All right? And therefore, with the increase in cardiac output, how do we do that? We increase your heart rate, and we increase the contractility. We make the heart contract harder, so it increases stroke volume. That increases our cardiac output. And then we increase our total peripheral resistance, which causes blood pressure to increase. Y'all see that? If you don't grasp it right now, it's okay. You got a lot to go over on the weekend, but you go over this slide here, all right, in these notes, and you'll understand it. Let me make all my scribbling disappear. Okay? This is a perfect example of that negative feedback system. Okay? That decreased blood pressure elicits the response of an increase in blood pressure. Negative feedback. Perfect example of it. Okay? All right. Let me just wrap up and do what happens when blood pressure increases. Okay, so now our blood pressure is going to increase. You start working out, doing whatever. Okay, so the more our blood pressure increases, the greater the stretch on the blood vessel wall, and the baroreceptors will increase their firing rate. Okay, so that firing, all right, those nerve signals are going to go up to the control center. Okay, so here's what's going to happen. It's going to go up to the cardioinhibitory center. It's going to activate the parasympathetic nervous system, and the parasympathetic nervous system is then going to have the pacemaker and the AV slow down the heart. How does it do that? Let's just slow down depolarization. All right, let's slow down the conduction system. And so it does that. Guess what? It's going to cause the cardioacceleratory center, all right, I'm not going to say inhibit it, but it's going to, what's the word? It's going to decrease its nervous information or nerve signals to the heart, okay? So it's going to kind of run like interference to the sympathetic nervous system, okay? So meanwhile, the vasomotor center here, all right, is then going to tell the sympathetic nervous system, let's turn our dimmer switch down a little bit, okay? Let's activate those beta-2 receptors. And what do the beta-2 receptors do? They cause the blood vessel to vasodilate, okay? So it's going to cause the beta-2 to cause vasodilation, and it's going to stimulate the alpha-1 less, okay? And that is going to cause, it's not up there, vasodilation. So in this situation, we're going to decrease both cardiac output because we decrease heart rates, all right? And thereby, we're going to decrease our stroke volume because the heart is not going to be pumping out as much blood on each beat, all right? And at the same time, we've decreased our resistance. And all of that lowers our blood pressure. So this is all neuroregulation. And neural responses are quick, okay? But you can't live weeks like this, okay? You can't live months like this. It doesn't work. This is a short-term situation, okay? You want long-term stuff? We're going to talk about that next class, but that is going to be, all right, the endocrine system. We're going to talk about when hormones decide to get involved, okay? Oh, I so much want to. Nope. This will give me something to talk about next class. Okay. So let's stop here. All right, and we will talk about. We'll finish up on Monday the neuroregulation of blood pressure. We'll talk about the endocrine system, and then we'll briefly talk about high blood pressure, things like that. Okay. Let's take a break. Okay, everybody at home. I'll meet you in lab. All right, quick break.